This week, it's top-down versus bottom-up. There's a couple of different ways to say this, right? So there's centralized government or a national government versus a decentralized or federal government. And the differences are broad. In fact, the notion of national versus federal was actually brought up during the Constitutional Convention. That no one wanted a national government because that's what the kings were. That's what kind of the Catholic Church was all about. There was no power distributed beyond the king, certainly not to the people. And so they invented a limited federal government. That is, there are just certain responsibilities it has. And then everything else, and then they reaffirmed this in the Bill of Rights, in the 10th Amendment, everything else belongs to the states and the people. And what was the reason for this? If you distribute power, you hopefully or lessen or attenuate power corrupting absolutely, right? The bigger government gets, the more power it has. You know, if you're worried about corruption in businesses, yes, there is. But man, the government is a $6 trillion enterprise. It's at least 15 times as big as the biggest corporation in the world. So it's like, do you want this big thing, or do you want this kind of distributed thing? And again, the nice thing about the distributed one is it does distribute power, and it breaks it up, right? It makes it in smaller pieces, 50 states and 330 million people. Now, the challenge on National Socialism, now they're going to tell you, look, we're the experts. We know how to tell you how to act, right? You know, and, you know, you can see it in simple things like, you know, EVs, electric cars. I mean, there's great incentives, but, you know, unless you're making $100,000, $150,000 or more, you can't afford them. So it's, you know, it's like, is that the right way to use your power to make rich people richer? You know, probably not. Another one that came up recently, we've heard about it in at least California, but they've talked about it in Washington, is getting rid of gas stoves. Well, is that a good idea? It's supposed to help climate, but when you look, it takes 3 times the amount of electric energy to heat your stove as gas. And all that electricity, almost all of it comes from natural gas and coal. The question is, are you really helping or are you hurting? So it's kind of like, are these experts that really know how to tell us what to do? Or do we need more responsibility in making good decisions? And the answer to that question is, I'd have to say a hearty yes. I don't know many dumb people that would say, hey, let me pay more to do this. It's not the right thing, right? But you go back to the distributed system. When you look at both ends here, you know, the kings and the feudal approach of socialism, or popes or whatever, I mean, they had this top-down, you know, tightly held situation where they made all the decisions, right? And it didn't work out very well. That's why most people in Europe gave up the power of the king or the queen, and to a lesser extent the pope. But on the other side, I think what's interesting, and you look at businesses during the time, businesses 16, 17, 1800, they were all that same hierarchically, you know, one man is going to tell everybody what to do in the company, and because companies weren't particularly large at that time, that kind of worked. But you move forward to today, and the federalist approach, the architecture where you distribute power out, is being adopted by almost every big business in the world. And you know why? Because they're gigantic. One guy at the top could never make all the decisions, right? Even in a company that's a couple hundred people, it's really hard for one person to make all the decisions because the company just stops at some point because they can't get enough done because one guy's making all the decisions. But man, in the 90s, you look at, you know, old big, you know, companies. I worked for AT&T, very top-down company. At the end of the day, they had to reformulate themselves, and they really went to a distributed model, but they all did. Google, I worked for a group called SAP. You distribute out to the regions, and the regions distribute to the people, and all these companies decided, you know, like the Constitution does and the Founding Fathers, how important their individual people were. You know, there's something called talent management. The idea of talent management in your HR department is how do we keep people? Because they're incredibly valuable, and it's hard to get new ones that are just as good, right? And so that's not the way it works over here. This is kind of like the HOA that you had that you never loved because they're walking around the neighborhood knocking on doors going, hey, there's a blade of grass out of place over there. You remember those days in the 90s. It was crazy, but it's that way with the federal government today. And both sides do this a little bit. And there's a reason why, and we'll get to that in something called performance-based government, which hopefully maybe both parties could maybe kind of cozy up to a little bit. But anyway, I mean, which one do you really want? If you're voting for a Democrat, you're going to vote for this hierarchical, centralized, we got it, we're going to tell you how to do it, to one where the Republicans are better, but not great. Certainly, they might get a C minus where you might get a D over here, or a B minus maybe, and they might get a D over here. But the idea is, you know, the better you distribute, the less likelihood you have, you know, power corrupting and absolute power corrupting, absolutely right. So this is not a good direction. This can be helpful, but they're still not quite there. And again, we'll get to performance-based government next week and talk about how can you, as a voter, help impress upon the people you vote for that they need to perform before they do politics. All right, I'm Tom Llewellyn. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks.